The lone survivor stumbled into Dutch Schultz's penthouse at 4 a.m., his white shirt drenched in blood that wasn't his own. 11 bodies were scattered across 127th Street, and he was the only one breathing. Schultz's hands trembled as he poured whiskey, not for celebration but to steady his nerves for what came next, because clutched in the survivor's shaking fist was a blood-stained envelope with 2 words scrawled across it in perfect handwriting: "Count again." Inside, tucked between newspaper clippings of the massacre, was something that made the most feared gangster in New York City realize he'd just declared war on the wrong man. And there was no going back. Drop your city in the comments right now. Where are you watching from? Here's a question that'll split this comment section down the middle. Is it ever justified for one criminal to eliminate another, or does that just make them equally evil? Smash that subscribe button, because we're diving into the real stories of organized crime that Hollywood doesn't have the guts to tell you. This is the night Dutch Schultz learned that Harlem wasn't for sale, wasn't for rent, and definitely wasn't afraid of white gangsters from the Bronx. This is the night 12 men walked into hell, and only one walked out to tell about it. The year was 1935, and Harlem was a powder keg wrapped in jazz music and desperation. Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Fliegenheimer to German Jewish immigrants, controlled the numbers racket in the Bronx with an iron fist and a hair-trigger temper that had left more bodies in the Hudson River than anyone cared to count. He'd clawed his way up from street-level beer running during Prohibition to becoming one of the most powerful gangsters in New York, rivaling even Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. But Schultz had a problem. Harlem's numbers game was printing money, and he didn't control a single digit of it. That's where Bumpy Johnson came in. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was Harlem's protector, its unofficial mayor, its most dangerous diplomat. While Schultz used fear and violence like a sledgehammer, Bumpy operated with the precision of a surgeon. He'd learned the streets from Stephanie Saint. Claire, the legendary Queenie who taught him that respect in Harlem wasn't taken, it was earned. By 1935, Bumpy controlled the policy banks, the protection rackets, and most importantly, the loyalty of every numbers runner, street hustler, and legitimate business owner in Black Harlem. But Dutch Schultz didn't care about loyalty or respect. He cared about money, and Harlem had millions of dollars flowing through its streets every week. Money that should have been his. The first approach came diplomatically. Schultz sent intermediaries, fellow white gangsters who suggested a partnership where Schultz would provide protection and take 70% of the profits, while Bumpy did all the actual work. Bumpy's response was delivered through one of those intermediaries, who returned to Schultz with a broken jaw and a message so offensive it couldn't be repeated in polite company. The gist was simple: Harlem belonged to Harlem, and Dutch Schultz could go straight to hell. Schultz's face turned purple when he heard the response. His associates watched him destroy his office, flipping his mahogany desk, shattering whiskey bottles against the walls, screaming obscenities that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. Because Dutch Schultz's entire empire was built on one principle: nobody told him no. "I want him dead," Schultz finally said, his voice deadly calm in the wreckage of his office. "I want Bumpy Johnson's head delivered to me in a box, and I want every person in Harlem to know what happens when you disrespect Dutch Schultz." What Schultz didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this moment since the first time Schultz's name was mentioned in connection with Harlem. Because Bumpy didn't just run the streets. He had eyes on every corner, ears in every speakeasy, and informants in places Schultz couldn't imagine. Bumpy knew about the hit before Schultz's 12-man crew even left the Bronx. The crew Schultz assembled wasn't amateur hour. These were stone-cold killers, Vincent Mad Dog Cole's former associates who'd survived gang wars that left entire neighborhoods traumatized. Tommy guns, revolvers, brass knuckles, and enough ammunition to start a small war. They drove into Harlem in 3 black sedans at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, confident that surprise and superior firepower would overwhelm any resistance. They had no idea they were driving straight into a trap. The plan was simple: hit Bumpy's headquarters at the Rhythm Club on 132nd Street, spray the place with Thompson submachine guns, kill everyone inside, and be back in the Bronx before sunrise. But when the 3 sedans turned onto 127th Street, the fastest route to their target, They found the road blocked by what appeared to be a broken-down delivery truck. "Go around it," barked Mickey the Hammer Rosenstein, Schultz's most trusted lieutenant leading the operation. But there was no going around. The street was too narrow, and before anyone could process what was happening, the delivery truck's sides dropped down to reveal concealed shooters. The muzzle flashes came from windows, from rooftops, from basement doorways that the crew didn't even know existed. Bumpy Johnson had turned an entire city block into a killing zone, and Schultz's 12 men had just driven straight into it. The gunfight lasted exactly 4 minutes. Witnesses later testified it felt like 4 hours. The sound of automatic weapons echoed off brownstone buildings, shattering windows and sending late-night residents scrambling for cover. Schultz's men tried to return fire, but they were completely surrounded, caught in a crossfire that military tacticians would later study for its brutal efficiency. Mickey Rosenstein died first, his body riddled with bullets before he could even exit the lead vehicle. The drivers of all 3 cars were killed within seconds, trapping the remaining gunmen inside rolling coffins. Some tried to run and were cut down in the street. Others attempted to surrender and learned that Bumpy Johnson wasn't accepting prisoners tonight. Only one man survived, and his survival wasn't an accident. His name was James Sullivan, Sully to his associates, a 28-year-old Irish kid from Hell's Kitchen who'd only been working for Schultz for 6 months. He wasn't a true believer in Dutch Schultz's empire, just a guy trying to make money in the only economy that would hire him. And Bumpy's intelligence network had identified him as the weak link, the one member of the crew who might actually deliver a message instead of dying for Dutch Schultz's pride. When the shooting stopped and 11 bodies lay motionless on 127th Street, Bumpy Johnson emerged from the shadows like a ghost materializing into flesh. He was immaculately dressed, even at 2 a.m., even after orchestrating a massacre, in a tailored 3-piece suit that probably cost more than Sullivan made in a year. His face was calm, almost serene, as he stepped over bodies and approached the only survivor. Sullivan was pressed against a bullet-riddled sedan, hands raised, knowing he was seconds away from joining his dead colleagues. But Bumpy didn't raise a weapon. He simply pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket and extended it toward the terrified Irishman. "How you're going to deliver this to Dutch?" Bumpy said, his voice carrying the cultured tone of someone who'd educated themselves through books instead of schools. "And you're going to tell him exactly what you saw here tonight. Every detail, every body, every bullet. You understand?" Sullivan nodded so hard his neck hurt. "Good. Because if you leave out even one detail, if you sugarcoat what happened here, if you try to make Dutch feel better about the mistake he just made..." Bumpy paused, letting the weight of the unspoken threat settle. "Then I'll know, and I'll find you wherever you run. There's no place in this country where Dutch Schultz's money can hide you from Harlem's memory." Sullivan took the envelope with shaking hands, and Bumpy did something that would haunt the young gangster for the rest of his life. He smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a threatening smile, but something almost pitying. "Tell Dutch that Harlem isn't the Bronx. Tell him we don't scare. Tell him if he sends 100 men next time, we'll send back 100 bodies. And tell him..." Bumpy leaned in close enough that Sullivan could smell his expensive cologne. "Tell him that the next person who dies for his stupidity will be him." Sullivan ran. He abandoned the blood-soaked sedan, abandoned his dead colleagues, abandoned any pretense of loyalty to Dutch Schultz, and ran through Harlem's streets like the devil himself was chasing him. And maybe he was, because every shadow seemed to hide another one of Bumpy's men. Every corner could conceal another ambush. Every window could be sheltering a sniper. By the time Sullivan reached the relative safety of the Bronx, he'd pissed himself twice and made promises to God he'd never keep. He delivered the envelope to Schultz at 4 a.m., his hands still shaking, his shirt still drenched in blood from Mickey Rosenstein's death. Schultz tore open the envelope, expecting a ransom demand or a list of terms for surrender. Instead, he found newspaper clippings of his own criminal exploits, photos of his family members going about their daily lives, and a handwritten note that read, "I know where everyone you love sleeps at night. Do you know where I sleep? BJ." But it was the final item in the envelope that made Dutch Schultz's blood run cold. Tucked beneath everything else was a single playing card, the Ace of Spades, known in criminal circles as the Death card. But this wasn't just any Ace of Spades. Written across it in neat handwriting was a list of 12 names, every member of the crew Schultz had sent to kill Bumpy Johnson, and next to 11 of those names was a small check mark. Next to Sullivan's name was a question mark. The message was crystal clear. Bumpy had known every name on that hit squad before they'd left the Bronx. He'd known their routes, their weapons, their plan. He'd let them come because he wanted to send a message that couldn't be misinterpreted, and he'd let Sullivan live not as an act of mercy, but as a permanent reminder that Dutch Schultz had been completely, utterly, humiliatingly outplayed. Schultz looked at Sullivan, who stood in the corner of the penthouse looking like he'd aged 10 years in one night. "Tell me exactly what happened, every detail," Sullivan told him. The ambush, the precision, the way Bumpy had walked through the carnage like he was strolling through Central Park, the calm, almost professorial tone in his voice, the smile that suggested this wasn't even close to the worst thing Bumpy could do if provoked. When Sullivan finished, Schultz's accountant, a nervous man named Otto Berman, who'd been quietly calculating the financial cost of losing 11 experienced gunmen, cleared his throat. "Boss, maybe we should reconsider our position in Harlem. The cost of this war—" "Shut your mouth," Schultz screamed, hurling his whiskey glass at the wall inches from Berman's head. "You think I'm going to let some—" He caught himself before saying the racial slur that almost escaped his lips, aware that even in his rage there were lines that couldn't be uncrossed in front of witnesses. "You think I'm going to let Bumpy Johnson make me look weak? Every gangster in New York is going to hear about this. Every punk kid on every corner is going to think Dutch Schultz is soft. But the thing about pride is that it clouds judgment, and Dutch Schultz's judgment was about to lead him down a path that would end in his own blood pooling on a bathroom floor in Newark, New Jersey. Because what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Bumpy Johnson had already made another move that would change everything. While Schultz was raging in his penthouse, Bumpy was sitting in a quiet restaurant in Little Italy, sharing wine with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, the two men who actually ran organized crime in New York. And they were discussing a problem they all shared. Dutch Schultz was becoming too unstable, too reckless, too much of a liability. "He's talking about killing Thomas Dewey," Luciano said, referring to the special prosecutor who'd been targeting organized crime. "If he murders a federal prosecutor, the heat that comes down will destroy all of us." Bumpy swirled his wine, letting the moment breathe. "Then maybe Dutch Schultz needs to retire." The Italian mobsters exchanged glances. They'd been thinking the same thing, but needed someone else to say it first. Someone who had a legitimate grievance, someone whose community had been threatened, someone who could provide the moral justification, however thin, for what they were about to do. "You have any objections to us handling this?" Lansky asked carefully. Bumpy set down his wine glass and met their eyes. "Just one. When it's done, Harlem stays Harlem. No encroachment, no partnerships, no white gangsters deciding what's best for black neighborhoods. We handle our own business, you handle yours, and we maintain professional respect." Luciano smiled. "Deal. But if Schultz comes at you again before we can resolve the situation, you're on your own." "I've always been on my own," Bumpy replied, standing to leave. "Difference is, now Dutch Schultz knows it too." 3 weeks later, on October 23rd, 1935, Dutch Schultz walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark with 3 associates for dinner. 2 men entered behind them, professional killers sent by the Commission, the governing body of organized crime that Luciano and Lansky controlled. The gunmen opened fire, killing Schultz and his companions in a hail of bullets that would become one of the most famous mob hits in American history. Dutch Schultz didn't die immediately. He lingered for 22 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherent statements that police stenographers frantically recorded, hoping for deathbed confessions. His final words were a rambling mixture of regret, paranoia, and fever dreams that mentioned mothers and money and mistakes. He never mentioned Bumpy Johnson, but in those final delirious hours, survivors said he kept asking the same question over and over. How did he know? How did he know? The answer was simple. Bumpy Johnson knew because he'd built something Dutch Schultz could never understand. Not just a criminal empire, but a community. Every shopkeeper, every numbers runner, every grandmother who sat on her stoop watching the street. They were all part of Bumpy's intelligence network. They fed him information because he protected them, employed them, invested in their neighborhoods when no one else would. Dutch Schultz had tried to take Harlem through fear and superior firepower. Bumpy Johnson held Harlem through something much more powerful. Loyalty earned through action, respect built over years, and the understanding that some things can't be bought or bullied into submission. Sullivan, the lone survivor of the massacre on 127th Street, disappeared after delivering his message to Schultz. Some say Bumpy honored his word and let the kid live. Others claim Sullivan ran so far from New York that he ended up working on fishing boats in Alaska, where neither Dutch Schultz's ghost nor Bumpy Johnson's reach could find him. A few cynics suggest he's buried somewhere in the foundation of a Harlem building, another casualty of a war that demanded absolute silence from its witnesses. But the message that Sullivan delivered, that blood-stained envelope with its playing card and its implications, became legendary in criminal circles. It was whispered about in speakeasies and policy banks, discussed in hushed tones by gangsters who'd never even met Bumpy Johnson, but understood what he represented. The principle that power isn't just about how many guns you have, but about how smart you are in deploying them. The massacre on 127th Street sent ripples through the entire underworld. Suddenly, white gangsters who'd been eyeing Harlem's profitable numbers racket reconsidered their expansion plans. Bumpy Johnson's reputation grew to mythic proportions, the man who'd turned Dutch Schultz's assassination squad into a cautionary tale. And more importantly, he'd established a precedent that would hold for decades. Harlem belonged to Harlem. Years later, after Bumpy had served his first stint in Alcatraz and returned to Harlem in the 1960s, a young reporter asked him about the night he killed 11 of Dutch Schultz's men. Bumpy's response was characteristically measured. "I didn't kill 11 men," he said calmly. "I defended my community against armed invaders who came to terrorize innocent people. There's a difference between murder and war, young man. Dutch Schultz declared war. I just made sure he understood the cost." "And the one you let live? Sullivan?" Bumpy smiled that same smile Sullivan had described, the one that seemed to carry both menace and wisdom. Every good story needs a witness. Every message needs a messenger. Sullivan wasn't mercy. He was strategy. "Do you regret any of it?" Bumpy looked out the window at the Harlem streets he'd protected for so long, at the children playing on corners that might have been controlled by Dutch Schultz's thugs if that night had gone differently. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing what was necessary. That's the difference between a criminal and a protector. Criminals take. Protectors give, even when what they give is violence to those who deserve it." The reporter published the interview, and it became one of the most quoted pieces about Bumpy Johnson's philosophy. But there was one part of the conversation he left out, something Bumpy said off the record when the notebook was closed, and the conversation was just between two men sharing truth. "You want to know the real message I sent that night?" Bumpy had asked. "It wasn't to Dutch Schultz. He was already dead, he just didn't know it yet. The message was to Harlem. I was telling my people that they didn't have to bow to white gangsters, didn't have to accept whatever scraps the mob decided to throw them, didn't have to live in fear of men who thought black lives were disposable." Did they get the message? They got it, and they've been standing a little taller ever since. The story of Dutch Schultz's failed hit on Bumpy Johnson became a defining moment in Harlem's history, not just as a criminal event, but as a cultural one. It represented the moment when Black Harlem stopped being treated as a colony to be exploited and started being recognized as a sovereign territory with its own power structure and its own rules. Churches held secret celebrations, though they'd never admit it publicly. Musicians wrote oblique references into jazz lyrics that only Harlem residents understood. Mothers told their children cautionary tales with modified details, leaving out the violence but keeping the core message: respect is earned, not taken, and Harlem bows to no one. But perhaps the most interesting footnote to this story involves what happened to that blood-stained envelope. After Dutch Schultz's death, His possessions were seized by federal authorities investigating his vast criminal empire. Most of his assets were never recovered, hidden in safety deposit boxes and buried caches that went to the grave with him. But that envelope, with its newspaper clippings and its ace of spades and its terrifying message, was found in his personal safe. Federal agents catalogued it as evidence, photographed it, and filed it away in some forgotten warehouse where it presumably still sits, a physical reminder of the night Harlem said no to Dutch Schultz and backed up that refusal with overwhelming force. Bumpy Johnson lived another 33 years after that night, becoming one of the most powerful and respected figures in Harlem's history. He went to prison multiple times, survived assassination attempts, navigated the civil rights movement, and mentored a young Malcolm X during his early years in Harlem. But according to those who knew him best, he never forgot the lesson of that night on 127th Street. Power without wisdom is just violence, strength without strategy is just brutality, and respect without reciprocity is just fear with a prettier name. When Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968, thousands attended his funeral, not just criminals but legitimate business owners, civil rights activists, ordinary Harlem residents who'd never run numbers or sold illegal whiskey, but who recognized him as the man who'd protected their community when no one else would. And somewhere in that crowd, if the stories are to be believed, was an older Irishman with haunted eyes who placed a single flower on the casket before disappearing into the crowd. No one asked his name. No one needed to. Because every survivor carries their scars differently, and James Sullivan had carried his for 33 years. The weight of 11 dead colleagues, the memory of Bumpy Johnson's smile, and the knowledge that he'd been allowed to live, not because he was lucky, but because he was useful. The message had been delivered. The war had been won. And Harlem had proven something that would echo through generations, that dignity isn't granted by those in power. It's claimed by those brave enough to fight for it. Dutch Schultz sent 12 men to kill Bumpy Johnson. Only one walked out, and the message he delivered changed everything, not just for Dutch Schultz, who was dead within weeks, but for every gangster who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. Harlem wasn't for sale. Harlem wasn't for rent. And Harlem definitely wasn't afraid. That was the message. That was always the message. And it's a message that still resonates in those streets today, in the pride of a community that stood its ground when the odds said they should have surrendered, in the memory of a man who understood that true power comes not from inspiring fear, but from earning respect. Dutch Schultz learned that lesson too late. Bumpy Johnson knew it all along, and that made all the difference.